All right, let me do my first check-in with On the Cusp of Contact, which well, we can talk about confronting my luncheon spot. So this is a collection of, I think it's 16 essays, and I'm just going to talk about each essay as I've finished it, just to get my thoughts kind of straight for then doing a check-in with Sean on Saturday or Sunday. So yeah, I'm taking advantage of having today off Thursday to actually get some reading done. So, number one essay is Race, Greed, and Something More: The Erasure of Urban Indigenous Space in Early 20th Century British Columbia. And this focuses on two particular urban spaces, Victoria and Vancouver, which in the kind of 1880s, 1870s, 1860s were the two major urban populations of Canada. And that had initially had the Squamish and the Songhees had their reserves pretty much right butting up against in what was going to become the urban space of the two cities, and then as it grew, expanded out, and thus the two kind of big drivers for erasing the indigenous presence and um, in the area were activated. That being race and greed, which is what this essay kind of details. But that's probably what the first half of this essay details, is how um, the kind of the ideology of race by the white settlers was used to fuel greed, because these reserves were on economically super attractive property, lands that the white settlers wanted to exploit, and were very open in exploiting. One thing that Barman says, this is Gene Barman who's writing this essay, says is, like, it's actually, from a historian's point of view, it's actually pretty easy to go back and read the actual motives for this stuff, because they're pretty open about it. We're getting rid of these dilapidated, degraded um, native people for their own good, because it's they're some of us some of the white colonists, not me of course, are setting a bad example, and they need to be separated from them. And in the same breath, will then go on to say about how there were millions and millions of dollars to be made off of this land once we got the natives off of it. Um, and she does a good does an interesting thing of kind of looking at the two different cases, because in the case of the Songhees people, now known as um, the Leg Leg Lek people, which I live here, but I have no idea how to pronounce that, and we'll have to look it up so I don't make a complete fool of myself. Um, and they were actually able to negotiate both a cash settlement for each of the 41, I think it's 41 families on the land, but also got basically their reserve moved into Esquimalt, just sort of down the thing, into basically suburban lands, which they did not think at that point they were going to need, that the white settlers didn't think they needed. So they were able to negotiate that. Where in the case of the Squamish people, one of the Squamish peoples on this particular parcel of land, they had not signed there had not been a treaty signed, and B, the provincial government sort of steamrolled it ahead without the participation of the federal government. This is when it was actually Canada, and that should not have happened. Um, and paid a little bit more money, but there was no equivalent reserve or land set aside for them. They were expected just to join one of the other Squamish tribes on their reserves. So sort of much less advantageous of a deal that way. So she makes quite the point of saying that prior to this point of I think it's like the like in the going from like the 1850s up until um, where does it hit? Because basically, there was actually, after they'd made their agreement in 815 with the Songhees agreed to give up areas of land wanted by the newcomers in exchange for which, quote, our village sites and enclosed fields are to be kept for our own use, for the use of our children, and for those who may follow us. So the Songhees Reserve was set up officially 119 acres in size and came into being. Um, versus the Squamish people um, were basically kind of informally, there's no treaties were negotiated, but the SNAUQ, SNAUQ, was the basis for a reserve of 37 acres requested in February 1868 by 42 persons living there under the leadership of Chief Chip Keum. And then within a half a dozen years later, a reserve commission expanded what became known as the False Creek or Kitsilano Reserve to 80 acres. Both, let's like note right off the bat that both the Songhees and False Creek Kitsilano are giant, very exclusive, um, very valuable pieces of land nowadays. Kitsilano, Falls Creek, that's like um, um, super prime real estate in Vancouver, and the Songhees is right across from the legislative buildings of downtown. Is massive, massive construction is actually going on there at the moment of development, and there's like tons and tons of like giant um, not townhouses, apartment buildings, very exclusive, very, very nice area, very picturesque. Um, so, but what happens is that changes this is that in 1958, for Victoria, the gold rush hits, and suddenly it goes from being kind of a very sleepy town to upwards of 25,000 miners arriving that year. A lot of them going through, but basically transforming it into a major way station going up into the into either the into interior BC and up the coast for gold, and with that came hardening attitudes towards indigenous population, and their and this idea of propriety coming into thing. The sentiments were basically so said that the close contingency of these Indians. This is a quote from a Royal Navy officer, is seriously inconvenient, and we get this whole kind of racist theory of it's going to be for their own good to get removed because they're being degraded by the not good elements among us, not us, but the not good elements. Also, the second justification is this thing of fears of sexuality. Um, Overwhelmingly, there was a big male imbalance to the settler population. You can especially see that with miners, but just in general, ton more dudes than women were coming to BC. Um, and as such, the majority of the and basically any Songhees women who were basically kind of engaged in the public domain, considered the purview of men, must be engaged in illicit behavior that was by definition sexual in nature. So while there obviously was, and the environment talks about here, there were sex workers in the thing, there was just also just women who were just who were doing jobs which weren't considered what a white woman would do, so thus were considered as being low and sexually loose. So that while indeed partners in other, well, that meant that many Sanghees and other indigenous women did indeed partner with newcomer men, in some cases for the moment, in others for a lifetime. There was also a lot of intermarriage, and that actually does come up, especially with the Sanghees, for how they were able to negotiate their thing, and there's the mixed descent of a lot of the Sanghees allowed them to um, come to a better and different agreements and better negotiating power with the colonial forces. Um, Now the big thing is that they wanted them moved. They wanted them moved. There was actually, of course, in all Canadian history, there was a federal provincial uh, loggerheads of who had the rights of ownership and thereby the responsibility to negotiate. So that thing, and that basically the economic benefit would be to ensure the federal authorities to authorize erasure so long as the 130 Songhees living there agreed to their proposed relocation. This they did not do. And this was paralleled in Vancouver, where in Vancouver it was the coming of the railway that really kind of expanded things out. Um, and the people, what's it, and increasingly are, as Robert A.J. McDonald explains, the people of Vancouver came to the view that the False Creek Reserve as a critical to the city's continued growth. Basically, they wanted it to expand into, um, and the Songhees living there resisted as strongly as the Squamish living there resisted as strongly as did the Songhees in Victoria. But um, and so they kept on erasing, they kept on pushing for this, but it was at an impasse. But the big things that happen is the changes in the leadership. First, into the changes of the leadership, both both of the kind of the elder leadership of both places, died, and they were replaced with a younger leadership, um, and and the second factor was that basically it was boom times, and there's just that overwhelming greed, newcomer greed, urge for, like, what is it saying, the Victoria City Council, which is funny because they're so very very otherwise now, but um, you know the Victoria City Council expressed amazement to the federal minister of the Interior in 1901 that the reserve, quote, located as it almost is in the center of the city for many years and within a stone's throw of business sections and some of the best business blocks, presents a contrast so marked and repellent as to excite the wonder of everyone that such a relic of barbarianism should be allowed to exist in the midst of the civilized conditions of a modern city. Um, and what the big thing that happens is that very much a activist premier, Robert McBride, um, was convinced that by the terms which BC entered join Canada in 1871, it gave it reversionary rights to reserve lands no longer being used for that purpose. And indeed, what happens is Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier pronounced in a parliament in April 1911 that, quote, where a reserve is in the vicinity of a growing town, as is the case in several places, it becomes a source of nuisance and is an impediment to progress. And a month later, the Indian Act is amended so that residents of, quote, any Indian reserve which adjoins or is situated wholly or partly within an incorporated town or city having a population of not less than 8,000 could be legally removed without their consent if it was in, quote, the interests of the public and of the Indians of the band of whose use the reserve is held. So yes, in their interest, because we're treating them like children, and we decide something is in your best interest to be moved away from the big city off of all that really valuable land, we will totally do it. Um, so that happens, and that's when they really start the push for erasure. The pushes for erasure come to fruition in thing. McBride and the federal government both negotiate for this $10,000 to each family, each family, not each person, each family, and that there's also going to be a new reserve up the way in Esquimalt, which is where it is now, and that, lest there be any second thoughts, the family heads were shown the bank books to be handed over once they physically moved to their new reserve, which they all did by the end of April 1911. Um, in contrast, in Vancouver, things were like a lot more roughshod, where the provincial but in the case of Vancouver, the provincial government also took the lead, but overshot the mark by acting wholly on its own ambitions, its own volition. So without actually, because they had actually had the Department of Indian Affairs had put the offers on hold until a Royal Commission on Indian Reserves was then underway, um, reported, whereupon the provincial authorities just acted. Um, Due process played no role, nor was federal approval sought. They made they made they made an offer slightly more, 11,250 total per family head. But and there was worries that it was they were that there was going to be a much larger offer being entertained by the federal authorities of 50,000. At which point the provincial government bullies basically, at the meeting of, what's it? The attorney general said, like, basically told the people, take it or you'll never get a cent. And another report told of the provincial government, quote, making threats out that they would be driven off by the police if they did not consent to sell. So really, really, um, bullying threats of stuff, and they did actually give in. Um, and at the end, the the provincial, you know, uh, you know, the provincial attorney general held a press conference looking to the future. He proclaimed how the eyesore to the citizens of Vancouver for many years and a hindrance to the development of the city would now make as much profit as possible for the entire province. So, you know, later in this day, he described in virtually the same breath how the Squamish would now be away from the temptations of the city, and this very valuable property should net us millions of dollars in profit, which is, pretty clear thing of like how the racism is basically used just as justification for getting these people off and them getting the land. And within 2 days, they were moved out and their houses were burned to the ground. Now, unlike the Songhees erasure, the Falls Creek Reserve was remained long in dispute due to the province's precipitous actions infringing on federal responsibilities for Indigenous people. The Squamish, who amalgamated politically in 1923, argued that they needed to agree to the surrender, and in 1947 they did so. The province then formally conveyed the land to its federal counterpart, which as much happened in Victoria, subdivided it into parcels for sale, which those are really, really expensive parcels of thing. So the kind of the second half of this is sort of showing um, how the Songhees were able to kind of maneuver. I have a doodle on my lap now. How the Songhees were able to maneuver things, and she goes into the difference between the Songhees. There was, starting right at the very top of the new leadership, there were individuals of mixed descent. There's a footnote talking about how the various different terminologies at this point, of at least this being published, mixed descent seems to be the preferred thing among scholars, so I will use that. Her noting like Métis has got something a very more ethnogenesis, kind of a cultural thing, whereas um, mixed descent is just simply saying that the chief, Michael Cooper, um, who you can just tell by the name, was was the product of a union between a Songhees woman and a father who was a lieutenant in the British military stationed on the San Juan Islands, adjacent to Victoria, following a fracas with the Americans in 1859. One of the little saber rattlings between the two countries. Um, so he had been baptized. He was baptized as a Catholic in Victoria, and in when he, at 6 months, he was educated in a Catholic, had a Catholic college education, not unlike many of his newcomer counterparts. He got elected chief, and solidified his Songhees credentials by marrying Sarah, the niece of the first Songhees chief, Freezy. And like Cooper, Sarah was born to an English father and a Songhees mother. Oh no, Freezy. No, yeah, Sarah. Like Cooper was born to an English father and a Songhees mother. She was also the widow of a Victoria Sea captain from Greece named Frank Albany, by whom she had 5 children. She would have 2 more with her new husband. Um, and so, and that Cooper's election corresponds with other interracial families moving into the Songhees reserves. And that's the interesting thing, is exactly just how mixed of a population the Songhees was. It was not, um, as they say, full blooded. There are people from Hawaiian, French Quebec, French Quebecois, and British descent, mixed with Songhees. And there's this interesting thing of, by this point, by the terms of the Federal Indian Act, only persons of status with status were permitted to live on reserves, and the acquisition of status demanded a father who was a status Indian, which seems to be something that, going by this, they basically just ignored. The officials were like, things are doing so well here. It's such a prosperous thing, made them look good, that they just simply looked the other way. Yet, when they did a 1901 census, the census found that like at least half of the 31 families had at least one person of mixed descent in, within that family structure. Yeah, the Fridays and Kamayas were in the tradition of the first Songhees chief, Freezy, named for his frizzy hair he inherited, it is said, from his Hawaiian father, one of several hundred hired to work in the fur trade. And I've heard about like the Hawaiian, I think Kanakas is what that's one thing. Yeah, and there's others of like establishment, Englishman, French Canadian father, and a lot of these, number of these fellows were also had also been educated at the Catholic St. Louis College, um, and so it's an interesting thing. I should really put my glasses on for all this, shouldn't I? It'll make it easier to see as I'm babbling to myself in long form, kind of going through this section. Um, Yeah, and just it's interesting. Like Chief Cooper exemplified the changing times, occupying a managerial position in a large Victoria company, which I think is salmon canning. With his neatly trimmed mustache, customary dress of suit, tie, and overcoat, and educated signature, he personified a new generation of leadership, consciously replicating the dominant society. By doing so, gazing back at it as almost as if through a mirror, which I think we get into some structural things here. Some post-colonial thought is where Barman might be talking about here. But that the idea that at various means Cooper was front and center, sometimes speaking in his own language to assert his indigenous credentials. And they bluntly refused lowball things of like $1,000 in 1906 and 2,000 in 1908. You know, um, and then and it's interesting here. You get the deputy superintendent of Indian Affairs, who's like, well, they're and just as rational and as we are, as the dominant, the now dominant white settler culture is, and that that you should it was, that they're independent and receive very little assistance. And they actually kind of floated the idea that maybe we should just the reserve should be subdivided by surveyed lots and allotted to the individual members of the band. um, and in return, the Songhees and their unmarried minor children shall cease in every respect to be Indians. um, Pointed out his superior how most of the members of the band, as far as I'm able to discover by personal observation, also by records, are not by any means of full blood, but in many cases are scarcely distinguishable from the white population. Now, when the Victoria Council got a load of, oh my God, you're going to give the land to them, they exploded in outrage, um, talking about how millions of dollars worth of building stocks, paved roads, and electrical cars, and all the appurtenances of modern life stood a row of unsight stood stood a row like just across the harbor stood a row of unsightly tumble down smoke covered wood shacks hardly removed from its primitive conditions of 100 years ago. So far as the city fathers were concerned, this incongruity, deformity, and impediment to the growth and commercial progress and prosperity of the city should be removed once and forever. Yeah. So they did not want them. They did not want them to stay safe. Finally, Cooper does oversaw negotiating later in 1910 and swapping the reserve for another of the virtually the same size, over 160 acres, in the on the harbor in nearby Esquimalt, and got a much higher payment than those 1,000, 2,000 of $10,000, equivalent of about $265,000 per family in today's dollars. Um, and he also, because Cooper is negotiating, he also determined eligibility. So among the 41 family heads on the list finalized with approval, 17 were of mixed ancestry, being Cooper himself, three, and a bunch of all others. They received what with them, particularly those who walked in two worlds, must have been viewed primarily in economic terms. So there's definitely the thing of before this, there was a leadership that was very much, no, I'm viewing this as ancestral home. My father's fathers lived here. Um, Now that seems to be more of a thing of, okay, we we're also taking economics into thing. Now this there was even among at the time, among those who was querying, this kind of shift in leadership, was the mixed ancestry daughter of the colonial governor, who in 1850 had arranged the treaty creating the Songhees Reserve, and saying, like, how is it that Chief Cooper, who was born on San Juan Island and whose father was a soldier, does not become a white man? How do the Albany boys, whose father was a Greek fisherman, after whose death the boy's mother married Cooper, and the boys were taken to the reserve, and each received $10,000. Are they Greek or Songhees? So there is sort of some kind of there seems to be an attempt to get payouts. 10 self-described full-blooded Songhees Indians hired a lawyer who detailed the non-Songhees inheritance of those receiving the money, and yet another group who lost out claimed quite accurately that the Albany sons were quarter breeds only, yet they are reported to have received $10,000 payments and a portion of the new reserve, and that Chief Cooper, quote, appears not to be an Indian at all, but was permitted to act as the arbiter of the rights of the individual Indians. Needless to say, Cooper's will did prevail in this matter. Um, you know, and from the perspective of most outsiders, the Songhees continued to be Indians. Um, but, and there's a thing here just saying, like, the money was put to good use. Apparently, the Department of Indian Affairs tracked it because, all those native people were going to waste stuff. I think there was like some charges of them buying cars. Seen shortly afterwards, some of them were seen driving about the city in their own autos! Exclamation mark. Um, but no, actually, they probably invested on a better basis than a lot of other things. But just in the conclusion of just how broadly pervasive were race and greed in erasing indigenous space in British Columbia's two major cities. Um, yeah, um, and there's there's a thing of they're mixed race off, and looking at more closely, we glimpse the important role played by Indigenous women in the larger course of events, which is weird. This is like their mixed race offspring facilitated the good deal made in Victoria and was echoed in Vancouver. I guess it's the large important role played by Indigenous women in that they hooked up with non-Indigenous men, and thus those mixed race offspring were able to facilitate a good deal made in Victoria that was then echoed in Vancouver, which seems like an odd thing to give pride of place. I mean, sort of more the mixed race result of the unions that might be given praise in that they understood how to mimic dominant society because they've been given the opportunity for education and stuff like that. As literary critic Homi Baba, this is somebody who I looked up his reviews, this literary critic, his reviews of his books, which sound like they're probably a very impenetrable to a straight like myself. If you're not inculcated in the jargonese of literary theory, I'm probably not going to get anything. But as literary critic Homi Bob Bob Bobha explains, the menace of mimicry is its double vision, which, in disclosing the ambivalence of colonial discourse, also disrupts its authority. So, and that Baba reminds us that the object of colonial discourse is to construe the colonized as a population of degenerate types on the basis of racial origin in order to justify conquest and to establish systems of administration and instruction, which seems like actually, yeah, that is a very precise, quick thing of what Barman puts forward is that, you know, sitting on all this valuable land, forward a racist, racial explanation of why they should be moved off the land, and then take the land for their own stuff, um, and continuing with like the Indian Act and shitty education stuff. Um, and the ambivalence of mimicry meant that over time they might become almost the same, but not quite. Which there was when it was interesting that yeah, actually that is an interesting thing of like when there was a possibility that the Songhees might become legally white, that was really rejected at the local level, like the Victorian Council and probably Victorians in general. Um, so they're almost the same, but not quite. And definitely the people living there wanted them to be separate. There's definitely this push for segregation that they didn't want them around. Um, so yeah, mixed race British Columbians living on the Songhees Reserve acted nonetheless. They used their education, understandings of the ways of dominant society, and realization of just how much their land was coveted to make the best deal possible they could for their families and for themselves. And they weren't any less driven by their own self-interest and perhaps greed. Um, but by acting, they accomplished something not easy to do within the racial confines in which they found themselves. They gazed back at the dominant society in a fashion beneficial to themselves and others on the Songhees Reserve, and also, a couple of years later, to their Squamish cousins, which it's this act of mirroring, I guess. That was that phrase that came up earlier, that idea of being of mirroring of what is that? Yeah, yeah, that's With his neatly trimmed mustache, customary dress of suit, tie, and overcoat, and educated signature, he personified a new generation of leadership, consciously replicating the dominant society by doing so, gazing back as if through a mirror. That is on page 17, and that definitely clicks with this whole thing of mirroring that mimicry, disrupting the thing, and then you know gazing back. They gaze back at dominant society in a fashion beneficial to themselves and others on the Songhees Reserve, and also a couple of years later to their Squamish cousins. So that idea of what kind of what kind of methods of survival um, a native community used to to continue on. Yeah, and I think in the notes it was mixed descent. This whole thing of the really bullshit thing of Wilfrid Laurier and the amendment to the Indian Act, where basically said like, oh, and if your reserve is anywhere near a big city, we can just take it, which is definitely the legal framework, so-called legal framework they had. And yeah, I definitely had this thing of like, oh, homie Bob Babaha sounds interesting, and then looking at the Goodreads stuff and going, oh, he's one of those guys. It's one of the guys where you think, oh, that's somebody who you want, somebody smart to explain his literary theories to you on what is it, of mimicry and man, in the location of culture, and the other question, stereotype, discrimination, and discourse, and the discourse of colonialism, also in the location of culture. So yes, which sounds like it would be a very tough book. But yeah, I guess, you know, for myself, talking about this with Sean, it's going to be talking about, um, wow, this is some place that I sit, that I go down to, and I have lunch with Jean, E and W, um, and that, you know, that I, definitely, um, the segregation that we have in Canada, that we've had for a long time in Canada, of pushing Native peoples onto reserves, and what does that come from? And it comes from what us wanting to push away the other more than it does, um, you know, using racist justifications of we're doing it for their own protection, and also loose women, um, you know, great benefit, ben, great pillars to rest our shitty history on. Um, yeah, yeah. Um, I think that's about all I want to say on that right now. Yeah, okay. I don't know if I've talked it out, um, and I'll go from there. But this just like, yeah, it's just interesting kind of, it's interesting, the whole thing of a mixed race thing of like, Canada, the government of Canada defined what it meant to be an Indigenous person, and used a very paternal thing of you can only get descent from your father, as a status Indian. If your mother is a status Indian, and you're born of her from mixed race, you're not a native, because they don't want to make more um, native people, and allow more native people to be in Canada, to subsume it in. That's obviously the big thing. And it's like, why isn't it both men and women? And that has gotten reversed. Um, yeah, yeah. So there's an interesting thing there of like, well, the people who did finally make the deal were people who weren't maybe as tied to things, or had white educations, had Catholic education, um, and arguably as a result got a better deal out of the situation. I don't know. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's the whole really gross racial stuff, and like, oh, how much do you need to be a native person, and is native person strictly your biology, or is it other stuff as well? Yeah, yeah. I will leave it there because I'm a know nothing bozo who doesn't really know any of that stuff. More videos later.